This video investigates a sensitive criminal case involving young victims and serious criminal offenses, including severe predatory acts. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. While he worked his mundane day shift at the Bluebird chip factory in the Auckland suburb of Manukau, families were barricading their homes with barbed wire come nightfall. They were looking for New Zealand's most notorious serial predator. They just didn't realize, the whole time, he was hiding in plain sight. This documentary aims to present an honest and unfiltered account of the case surrounding the serial predator, Joseph Thompson. The timeline of Joseph Thompson's offending reveals a staggering failure of detection. While the public panic reached its fever pitch in the early 1990s, Thompson's reign of terror actually began much earlier, in the year of 1983. For a full decade, police were unaware that a single individual was responsible for the string of attacks that were occurring across the region. It wasn't until the year of 1993 that detectives first suspected a serial offender might be at work. The realization came following a terrifying home invasion in February of that same year. Police records detail a harrowing home invasion where a young victim was held for over 4 hours, with the offender moving her from room to room throughout the prolonged ordeal. The dread of the night was compounded by the fact that her mother had been immobilized by the intruder, restrained on a couch nearby, helpless to intervene. The offender, described only as a well-spoken Maori man with a ponytail and roughly 1.8 meters tall, threatened to kill both of them before fleeing into the night. The police managed to track him briefly to John Walker Drive, a street in the suburb of Clendon, Manukau, before unfortunately losing his trail. As 1993 progressed, the frequency of the attacks made the pattern impossible to ignore. Reports confirmed that later in August, a teenage girl was taken in Clendon. In a terrifying display of his surveillance, Thompson lured her outside by claiming her cousin was waiting for her, using the family member's name to gain her trust. Then, under the cover of rain, the victim was forcibly taken to the nearby Mountford Park. 2 months later, a young girl woke to find the armed intruder in her living room, while her brother slept just meters away. By the end of 1993, police had officially linked the crimes, identifying a serial predator who had struck more than 8 times since 1989 in the suburbs of Otara, Manuriwa, and Wiri. The reality, however, was far, far worse. Thompson's actual list of victims by that time already topped more than 30. The psychological toll on the South Auckland community was immediate and profound. By late 1993, a story headlined, "Fear Has Grip on Manuriwa," flooded newsstands, reflecting the palpable terror in the suburbs. The police investigation, codenamed Operation Park, a direct reference to the Mountford Park incident, confirmed links to multiple harrowing violations and incidents. Residents stopped taking chances. Children were no longer left to walk to school on their own, with fearful parents opting to pick up and drop them off instead. The fear was so pervasive that one woman, desperate for a greater police presence in her neighborhood, lied about being attacked. It was a measure of desperation that backfired, resulting in the woman herself facing charges for laying a false complaint. The victims Thompson targeted were specific. Police knew he tended to choose Maori victims, many of whom were young females and teenagers. His choice of territory was cold and calculated. Thompson exploited the vulnerabilities of the neighborhoods he lived in, targeting lower socioeconomic communities, knowing that doors and windows were often insecure. He preyed on households where children were left alone, or households with single mothers, where he believed there would be no male figure present to stand in his way. He hunted at night, displaying an intimate knowledge of the areas he offended in, knowing exactly what fences to jump, which parks and reserves to cut through, and which alleyways to use. The trauma inflicted on his victims was life-altering. One victim, a young babysitter, later told the press she walked down the street, wondering if every man she passed was the one who had threatened her life. Another teen became obsessed with cleanliness, bathing 5 times a day and washing her clothing and linen 10 times a day, in a desperate bid to scrub away the memory of her attack. The fear extended to the civic leaders of the time. Mayor Sir Barry Curtis recalled that residents were going as far as putting number 8 wire around their properties to prevent the predator from entering their homes. The police response was massive, yet for a long time ineffectual. Operation Park eventually grew to include 40 officers, but in the early stages, the investigation team was under immense pressure, battling with the fact they didn't have any real leads. Initially confident in their ability to catch the predator, as time went on and progress stalled, police were forced to be honest about the situation, admitting, "We don't have any idea really who the offender is." Detective Sergeant Henwood, one of the lead officers on the case, recalled the stress of the era, noting that at the time, dealing with serial predators was not something New Zealand police were experienced in. "We had to read up on it," Henwood stated. The lack of progress caused a rift between the police and local leaders. In April 1994, the Manukau city mayor made a rogue plea for information, asking people to contact him directly and offered a personal guarantee of confidentiality. His actions drew sharp criticism from the police, who pointed out he had no legal authority to protect informants, feeling the mayor had stepped out of line and was offering false promises. However, the mayor wasn't worried about protocol, he was worried about his community. 2 years is 2 years, Sir Barry later recalled, feeling that the lack of progress forced him to take a different approach. I got to the stage where I had to try a new way, he stated. All the while, as authorities argued and disagreed, the list of victims continued to pile up. The community remained engulfed by terror, still being hunted by a man who the police had no name or face for. Detectives were forced to pull and go through old files, sitting up in bed at night reading unsolved complaints, all in a frantic bid to build a profile. In reality, police weren't any closer to catching him. Their only description hadn't changed much. A man of either Maori or Pacific descent, in his 20s, actually closer to 1.7 meters tall, and now had short hair. By early 1994, the suspect list had ballooned to 600 people. The investigation was a tedious, grinding process of elimination. Desperate for a breakthrough, police offered a $50,000 reward for information leading to a conviction, the highest ever offered by police at the time. When that failed to generate leads, the reward was raised to $100,000. The investigation was characterized by red herrings and controversy. Police found white sneakers on a lawn, a discarded blood-stained jacket, and a distinctive Stanley screwdriver, all false leads that led nowhere. As the pressure mounted in 1995, police began a controversial practice of approaching men in the street who matched the generic description, asking for voluntary vials of blood. This quote-unquote blooding technique drew criticism from the Criminal Bar Association, who called it unjustified. The desperation of the sweep was highlighted by its indiscriminate targeting. Professional rugby player Eric Rush was pulled aside while shopping at the Manukau Mall, located in the city centre. Rush recalled officers approaching him in a record store, telling him he fit the profile and asking for a blood test. I was a little bit like, oh shit, but then I thought if it was going to catch the guy, then I have no worries doing it, he stated. When a male officer outside the store realized who Rush was, he quickly stepped in, saying, "Look mate, you don't have to do this." But like many in the community who had young daughters and kept baseball bats in the corner of their rooms, Rush obliged, submitting to the test to help the cause. Despite the rewards and the mass screenings, the breakthrough did not come from a tip-off, but instead from forensic persistence. The turning point was a size 10 shoe print left at the scene of a Papa Toi Toi attack back in 1994. Police identified the print as belonging to a distinctive John Bull branded work boot. Over 8 months, they found the same shoe print at 6 other attack sites, allowing them to refine the profile of the perpetrator. This forensic evidence was combined with a blood sample left behind at a scene where a young victim had fought back, causing the attacker to cut his hand on her tooth. Analysis revealed that the offender had a blood type shared by only 20% of the population, a crucial detail that allowed police to greatly narrow down their list of suspects. Police were also using a computer program, revolutionary at the time, to generate names of offenders who fit a specific profile, someone who committed burglary in their teens, predatory offenses in their mid-20s, and lived near the location of their first offense. Thompson initially slipped through the cracks because he was 36 years old, and the profile suggested the predator would be under 35. However, when the list was refined using the blood type evidence, in conjunction with the size 10 John Bull shoe print, a new pool of roughly 80 names was generated, and Joseph Thompson was on it. In the month of May 1995, police arrived at Thompson's home. Citing religious grounds, Thompson refused to give a blood sample. He did, however, agree to provide an oral swab. It was a fatal error for the predator, which would be the beginning of his undoing. Forensic scientist Sue Vintner was able to use the saliva to link his DNA to the horrific crimes. The technology was slower back then, requiring weeks for absolute confirmation, but in the end, the results were definitive. 2 months later, when Detective Sergeant Henwood returned to Thompson's house in the month of July, the man who had eluded them for a decade surrendered without a fight. He looked at the officers and simply stated, "I've been waiting for you guys. It had to come, I know that." What followed was a marathon of disturbing disclosure. Over the course of a grueling 18-hour interview, he provided a full confession, but the confession itself didn't end in the interrogation room. Thompson was placed in the back of a police car and taken on a surreal tour of South Auckland. Acting as a guide to his own atrocities, he pointed out the homes he had violated, identifying a further 8 attacks that the police didn't even have on their own files. On the 17th of July, 1995, Joseph Thompson appeared in the Otahuhu District Court, initially answering to 15 counts of sexual violation. By the end of the month, the full scope of his offending was laid bare. He stood before the courts to answer a staggering 129 charges, including 46 sexual violations of women and young females. He pleaded guilty to every single charge. At the time, it was believed to be the record number of guilty pleas in the history of the Commonwealth. The summary of facts read out in court painted a picture of a monster operating without restraint, revealing that in 1994 alone, Thompson had committed 14 separate attacks. The court heard harrowing details of his methodology, confirming a pattern of abductions and home invasions that had gone on for over a decade. Although officially convicted for attacks on 47 members of the public, police estimates presented during the aftermath suggested the true number of victims was likely closer to 70. The sentencing reflected the sheer scale of the horror, and Justice Fisher sentenced Thompson to 30 years imprisonment with a minimum non-parole period of 25 years. In his closing remarks, the judge delivered a damning assessment of the man standing in the dock, stating, "It is difficult to think of any person who has brought more pain and misery to so many people in New Zealand history." In court, Thompson stood with his head bowed, eyes fixed to the floor, and his voice reduced to a whisper. Several hundred people gathered outside to catch a glimpse of the man who had terrorized their families. One man, whose cousin had been attacked, stated, "All I want is a look at him." But he would be denied that satisfaction. As Thompson was led from the courthouse, separated from the public by a wire fence, he refused to face the community he had haunted, choosing to hide beneath a grey woolen blanket as police escorted him past the waiting crowd. The investigation into Joseph Thompson's background revealed a cycle of abuse that culminated in his monstrous offending. Born in Whakatane into a family of 12 children, his home life was one of insecurity and hardship, and was described as being similar to a scene from the 1994 New Zealand tragedy film, Once Were Warriors. Thompson himself was abused by a family friend, a man who would creep into his bed during parties and reward the young Joe with loose change as payment for the abuse. But the violence in the home wasn't limited to visitors. In 1996, less than a year after Joseph's conviction, his father, Charlie Thompson, was also imprisoned for historic acts of abuse against two of his daughters. By age 15, Joseph had dropped out of school and joined a gang known as the Stormtroopers, drifting into petty crimes such as car theft and burglary. However, as he entered into adulthood, he appeared to leave the streets and overt crime behind. He secured steady employment at the Bluebird chip factory and fathered children, creating a veneer of suburban normality. But behind closed doors, his relationships were volatile, marked by domestic violence and alcohol, a precursor to the violence he would soon inflict on strangers. His ability to compartmentalize his life was perhaps the most chilling aspect revealed after his arrest. While the police operation was underway, Thompson was living a domestic double life. In 1990, he even sat with his own children and watched a crime show television reconstruction of one of his own attacks, silently observing the hunt for himself. In hindsight, experts identified a major mistake in the way the case was handled. They now believe that the decision to run ads, pleading for him to surrender, actually taught him to better conceal his evidence. Rather than appealing to his conscience, it likely just made Thompson more cautious. Even as the net tightened in early 1995, Thompson acted as if he had a future. He married his partner Joanne in March of that year, just 4 months before his arrest. When police finally zeroed in on him, it was revealed just how close he came to striking again. During the tense weeks in June, when authorities were waiting for the DNA results to come back, Thompson was placed under tight surveillance. Police believe that 2 further attacks were thwarted during this surveillance period alone. Decades after his conviction, Thompson remains behind bars. In his most recent parole hearing in January 2025, the board noted that while the 66-year-old had finally completed the child abuse offender treatment program, he was still assessed as being an above average to well above average risk of reoffending. The board declined his release, ruling that he remains an undue risk to the community. He will not be eligible for another hearing until November 2026. The conviction of Joseph Thompson closed a dark chapter in New Zealand's criminal history, and while some survivors have managed to rebuild their lives, the scars may never truly fade. For many, the trauma is a life sentence that no court can overturn. This case serves as a chilling reminder that the most dangerous monsters aren't the ones you expect. More often than not, the ones you should truly fear are the monsters hiding in plain sight. What are your thoughts on the parole board's decision to decline his release and keep him behind bars? Do you believe the justice system has finally got it right? Can a person like Thompson ever integrate back into society? Share your perspectives in the comments below. If you found this documentary informative, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more in-depth explorations of often overlooked, lesser-known stories. Who else would you like to see us detail next? Your engagement helps us continue to shed light on otherwise unheard narratives.